Somewhere, right now, someone is setting the table for one less person than they used to. Somewhere else, someone is opening their phone to call someone, halfway through dialing, before remembering that number doesn't reach anyone anymore. Both of them have been told, at some point, some version of, "You'll move on." Neither of them has. Not really. And this episode is going to argue that was never actually the goal in the first place. The lie in moving on. The phrase, "move on," carries an assumption almost nobody questions directly. That healing means leaving the loss behind, putting distance between yourself and what happened, until eventually it stops being part of your life at all. This assumption causes real damage because it sets an impossible standard. Picture someone, years after a significant loss, still occasionally moved to tears by an old song, a familiar smell, an anniversary date, and quietly concluding that this means they failed to move on the way they were supposed to by now. Nothing has failed. Loss doesn't get left behind the way a stop on a road trip does. It gets integrated, carried forward differently, as part of a life that keeps expanding around it, rather than something that ever fully disappears from view. What loss actually takes? To understand why this process is so much larger than most people expect, it helps to name specifically what a significant loss actually removes, because it is rarely only the obvious thing. Picture someone who loses a parent. The obvious loss is the person themselves. But underneath that single loss sit dozens of smaller ones, rarely named directly. The daily habit of a certain phone call, the specific way that person laughed at a particular joke, an entire imagined future that included them. Holidays, milestones, ordinary Tuesdays that will now happen without them in the room. This is equally true of other kinds of loss. A relationship that ends takes not just the partner, but an imagined future, a daily rhythm, sometimes a shared circle of friends. A job lost takes not just income, but identity, structure, a sense of where you belonged each morning. Naming these smaller, specific losses, rather than treating grief as one single, undifferentiated wave, often makes the enormity of it feel slightly more comprehensible. Grief has no schedule. One of the most damaging beliefs about loss is that it should resolve within some reasonable, socially acceptable window. Weeks for a smaller loss, a year or two for a larger one, after which continued grief starts to look, to others, and eventually to the person themselves, like something being handled poorly. Picture someone who, 18 months after losing someone significant, still has hard days that arrive with no warning. If they've absorbed the belief that grief should be finished by now, this becomes a second wound layered on top of the first. Not just the loss itself, but the added burden of feeling like they're failing at grieving correctly, on some invisible timeline nobody actually agreed to. There is no fixed schedule. Grief tends to soften in intensity and frequency over time for most people, but softening is not the same as ending on a deadline, and expecting the second produces nothing but unnecessary additional suffering layered onto an already difficult process. Grief doesn't move in a straight line. Many people carry an assumption, often absorbed from popular but oversimplified models of grief, that it moves through a tidy, linear sequence. An early stage, a middle stage, and eventually an end stage of acceptance, each one completed before the next begins. Real grief rarely behaves this way. Picture someone who felt, for weeks, like they'd reached a stable, accepting place with a loss, only to be blindsided by a wave of raw, fresh pain months later, seemingly out of nowhere, triggered by something as small as a season changing or a familiar smell in a grocery store. This is not regression. It is not evidence that the earlier progress wasn't real. Grief tends to move in waves rather than a straight line, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, occasionally distant enough to be forgotten for a while, and then close again without warning. Expecting a tidy, one-directional progression sets people up to interpret a completely normal wave as a devastating step backward. Why we try to rush it anyway? If grief genuinely can't be rushed on a fixed schedule, why does almost everyone, including well-meaning people around someone grieving, quietly push for exactly that? Because sitting with someone else's unresolved pain, with no clear end date, is deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved, including the person offering support. Picture friends and family, months after a loss, gently suggesting it might be time to think about moving forward, not out of cruelty, but out of their own discomfort with pain that has no obvious resolution they can offer or witness. The person grieving often absorbs this pressure and begins, consciously or not, performing a recovery timeline for the benefit of everyone around them, appearing more fine in public than they actually feel in private, which tends to isolate them further at exactly the moment real support matters most. Carrying it forward, not getting over it. Here is the reframe this entire episode is built around, and it's worth sitting with directly. The goal was never to get over a significant loss, in the sense of returning to exactly who you were before it happened. That version of you, in a meaningful sense, no longer exists. The loss changed something permanently, and pretending otherwise isn't healing. It's denial wearing healing's clothing. Picture someone carrying a loss the way a tree carries a scar from a broken branch. The tree doesn't grow back exactly as it was before the break. It grows around the injury, incorporating it into a new shape that includes the damage as part of its structure going forward, rather than erasing all evidence it ever happened. This is what carrying it forward actually looks like. Not forgetting, not being fully defined by the loss forever either, but building a life that has genuinely made room for what happened, rather than a life spent pretending it didn't, or a life permanently frozen at the moment it did. The guilt of feeling okay again. There is a specific, rarely discussed part of this process that deserves direct attention because it quietly sabotages a lot of people's healing. The guilt that arrives the first time joy returns, unexpectedly, after a significant loss. Picture someone who, months after losing a parent, finds themselves genuinely laughing at something funny, and is immediately hit by a wave of guilt, as if that laughter were a betrayal, evidence that the loss mattered less than it should, or that they're somehow moving on too quickly or too easily. This guilt, though understandable, rests on a false premise, that continued suffering is what proves love or importance, and that feeling okay again means the loss is being minimized. In reality, the capacity to feel joy again alongside an ongoing, integrated grief is not a betrayal of what was lost. It is simply what a full human life, continuing to be lived, actually looks like. Grief and joy occupying the same life, sometimes even the same afternoon, without either one canceling the other out. Different kinds of loss, different kinds of grief. Not all significant losses follow identical shapes, and it's worth distinguishing between a few common types, because each carries its own particular difficulty. Picture the loss of a person through death, final, with no possibility of reversal, but often accompanied by clear rituals and social acknowledgement that help mark and validate the grief. Now picture the loss of a relationship through separation, where the person is still alive, sometimes still nearby, which can complicate grief in a different way entirely. A kind of ongoing, unresolved mourning for someone who technically still exists, just not in the role they used to occupy. Now picture a third kind, the loss of an imagined future. A career that didn't happen, a version of a family that never came together the way it was pictured, a dream quietly abandoned after years of pursuit. This kind of loss often goes almost entirely unacknowledged by others, precisely because there's no funeral, no clear event marking it, which can make it in its own way a strangely isolating grief to carry, since there's rarely a socially recognized moment to grieve it out loud. Grief nobody else fully understands. Even with genuine support from caring people, there is often a specific, quiet loneliness embedded inside grief itself. The recognition that no one else grieves this particular loss in quite the same way, or from quite the same angle that you do. Picture several family members grieving the same person's death: a parent, a sibling, a spouse. Each of them lost a genuinely different relationship with that same person, carries different memories, different regrets, different specific absences. Even surrounded by people who share the loss, each person is, in an important sense, grieving alone with a version of it nobody else can fully access. This isn't a reason to withdraw from support during grief. Connection still matters enormously, discussed at length elsewhere in this series. It's simply worth naming honestly. Some part of any significant grief is carried privately, regardless of how much genuine company surrounds it, and expecting full understanding from anyone else, even the most caring people available, sets an impossible bar that adds unnecessary disappointment to an already difficult process. What actually helps? Presence, not fixing. For anyone supporting someone else through significant loss, there's a specific, common mistake worth naming: the urge to fix, to find the right words that make the pain go away, to offer a solution to something that isn't actually a solvable problem in that sense. Picture someone showing up for a grieving friend armed with advice, silver linings, and reasons things happen for a purpose, well-intentioned and often experienced as somewhat hollow or even mildly invalidating by the person actually grieving. Now picture someone else who simply shows up, sits with the discomfort of not having anything to fix, and says something closer to, "I don't have anything that makes this better, but I'm here." And then, crucially, actually stays. Presence, without an agenda to resolve the pain quickly, tends to be received as far more genuinely supportive than any well-meant attempt at fixing something that, by its nature, simply needs to be carried through rather than solved outright. Finding meaning without forcing a silver lining. There is a difference between meaning that emerges genuinely, in its own time, and meaning forced prematurely onto a loss, in an attempt to make it feel more bearable before someone is actually ready for that. Picture someone, weeks after a loss, being told, "Everything happens for a reason." A sentence that, however well-intentioned, often lands as dismissive rather than comforting, because it skips straight past the pain toward a resolution the grieving person hasn't reached yet, and may never fully reach in that exact form. Meaning, when it does eventually arrive, and for many people, some version of it eventually does, tends to be discovered rather than assigned. A changed sense of what actually matters, a deepened compassion for other people going through something similar, a clarity about priorities that wouldn't have arrived any other way. This kind of meaning, found in its own time, differs enormously from meaning forced onto a fresh wound by someone uncomfortable simply sitting inside the not yet resolved pain of it. Small steps forward. At some point, alongside the ongoing grief, life does require some form of continued movement. Not because the loss is finished, but because a life still has to be lived alongside it. Picture someone taking the smallest possible step back toward ordinary life after a significant loss, returning to a familiar routine, however briefly, or doing one small task that used to feel normal before everything changed. This is not a betrayal of the loss, and it does not require feeling fully ready first. Very often, capability arrives through the act of doing the small thing, rather than waiting to feel ready before attempting it. The same principle discussed in an earlier episode of this series about moving through fear rather than waiting for it to disappear first. Small, forward movement alongside grief, not instead of it, not in denial of it, tends to be what actually helps rebuild a functioning life, one modest step at a time, rather than any single decisive moment of being ready that many people wait for indefinitely, sometimes never arriving at all. The waves that return. Even long after a loss, certain moments tend to bring the grief back with surprising intensity. Anniversaries, birthdays, specific dates that mattered to the relationship or the life that was lost. Picture someone, years after a loss, finding themselves unexpectedly low and unsettled every year around a particular date, sometimes without immediately connecting the mood to the anniversary itself. This is an extremely common and entirely normal pattern, not a sign that healing has failed or reversed. The nervous system, in a sense, remembers dates and seasons, even when the conscious mind has moved on to other things day to day. Anticipating these waves, rather than being blindsided by them each time, often makes them considerably easier to move through. Planning something intentional and gentle around a difficult date, for instance, rather than being caught off guard by a grief that arrives right on schedule, year after year, in its own quiet way. What loss teaches about what actually mattered? There is one final, often overlooked aspect of significant loss worth naming honestly. As painful as it is, it also tends to clarify, with unusual sharpness, what genuinely mattered all along, sometimes more clearly than almost anything else in life manages to. Picture someone who, after a significant loss, finds themselves far less tolerant of spending time on things that don't actually matter to them. Surface-level obligations, relationships maintained out of habit rather than genuine connection, work that never aligned with what they actually cared about. Loss, in this specific and difficult way, often functions as an unwanted but genuinely clarifying teacher about priorities that had perhaps drifted without anyone noticing. This doesn't make the loss worth it, and nothing in this episode suggests it should be framed that way. But it's honest to acknowledge that many people, looking back, describe their losses as having permanently reordered what they consider important. Not because the loss was good, but because facing something that significant tends to strip away a great deal of what was never actually essential in the first place. The practice, not the moment. Like everything else explored throughout this series, moving forward after loss is never accomplished in a single moment of resolution. It's built the same quiet way discipline, patience, forgiveness, and every other quality discussed in this series are built, through small, repeated choices that rarely feel significant on their own. The small step back toward ordinary life, taken before feeling fully ready for it. the guilt over unexpected joy, noticed and released rather than obeyed. The wave that returns on an anniversary, met with less panic because it was expected this time. The meaning that arrives, eventually, in its own unforced time, rather than being demanded prematurely from a wound still fresh. None of it erases what was lost, and none of it was ever supposed to. But it accumulates, quietly, into a life that has genuinely made room for the loss, carrying it forward as part of a larger, still continuing story, rather than either abandoning it entirely or being permanently frozen by it. That is what you carry forward. Not because it stops mattering, but because you learn, slowly, how to keep living alongside it,